She said it on a Friday morning in September, standing at the edge of her father's wheat field with her boots in the mud and her arms crossed against the early cold. And he heard it the way you hear something that rearranges everything you thought you knew about a place you'd been standing in for years. He had not planned to say anything at all. He'd come to return a borrowed wagon wheel, which was a simple errand and should have taken 10 minutes. Instead, he'd found her out in the field alone, walking the rows, checking the stalks the way her father used to before his hands got bad. He watched her for a moment before she noticed him. She didn't perform anything. She just walked and looked, and occasionally crouched down to examine something close. A woman doing what needed doing, the way she always had. When she finally saw him, she raised a hand in greeting, and he walked over, and they stood looking at the field together for a moment before he said, without planning it, without any warning from his better judgment, "You know, Bea, whoever ends up with you is going to be the luckiest man in Harlan County." He meant it honestly. He expected her to wave it off the way she waved off most compliments. A small dismissive sound, a subject change, a deflection so practiced it had become reflex. Instead, she went quiet. She looked at the field a moment longer. Then she looked at him, and her expression was something he hadn't seen on her before, something that had been kept careful and private for a long time. "I've been hoping that man was you," she said. Not loudly, just clearly. The field kept being a field. The wind kept moving through the wheat. A crow lifted off from the far fence post and crossed the gray sky without hurry. And Wesley Holt stood in the mud next to Beatrice Crane and understood, the way you understand a thing that has always been true, that his life had just shifted in a direction he had not been looking. Wesley Holt was 31 years old and ran a modest sheep operation on the west side of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1887. He had come to the county at 24, with nothing but a good horse, a recommendation from a man his father had known, and a capacity for work that other people found either admirable or exhausting, depending on their temperament. 7 years later, he had a small house, a decent flock, a reputation for doing what he said he'd do, and not much else. He wasn't a complicated man. He didn't want complicated things. He wanted the land to be good, and the animals to be healthy, and his word to mean something, and mostly it did. He had no particular expectations about marriage. His mother had died when he was 12, and his father 2 years after that, and somewhere in those losses he had quietly adjusted his expectations of permanence. He still wanted things. He just didn't reach for them directly anymore. It was easier to let the wanting stay quiet. His nearest neighbors to the north were the Crane family. Thomas Crane, 62, a wheat farmer with a bad back and a good reputation. His wife, Adeline, who made the best biscuits in the county and knew it. And their daughter, Beatrice, who had come back to help after her mother's hip gave out 2 winters ago and had simply never left. Beatrice Crane was 28. She had studied for a year at a teacher's college in Wichita before circumstances brought her home. She woke before her parents, made the bread, kept the accounts, managed the correspondence with the grain buyer in Abilene, and drove the wagon to town every other Saturday without anyone asking her to. She did all of it without resentment and without calling attention to it, the way some people carry things. Not because they have to, but because no one else is going to, and they are not the kind of person who sets things down and walks away. Wesley had known her for 4 years. He had spoken to her dozens of times. He had helped the Crane family get their harvest in when Thomas's back went out the first time, and he had eaten at their table twice since then, and he had thought in a vague and unexamined way that Thomas Crane had raised a capable daughter. He had not thought more than that. He had not let himself. That September morning was the beginning of his thinking more. The county held a harvest supper at the Methodists' Hall on the 3rd Saturday of October. It was the kind of gathering that mattered in small places, not because the food was exceptional, though it generally was, but because it was one of the few occasions when everyone appeared in the same room at once and the social work of a whole season could be done in an evening. Old debts acknowledged, new arrangements proposed, who was struggling and who had come through. Wesley arrived to find the hall already crowded. He found the Crane family near the food table, Thomas moving carefully on account of his back, Adeline talking to the pastor's wife, and Beatrice helping two older women carry dishes from the kitchen, because she had noticed they were having trouble, and the obvious thing to do was help. She was wearing a dark green dress he hadn't seen before. It was not elaborate, it was just right. He danced with a few people out of politeness. He talked about the weather, the wheat prices, the mild concern everyone had about an early frost. At some point, he ended up standing near the door with a cup of coffee and watching the room, and the thing he noticed, without particularly meaning to, was that Beatrice Crane was never without someone to talk to, not because she sought it out, but because people went to her. There was something in her manner, patient, direct, genuinely interested, that made people feel they had said something worth saying. He watched this for longer than he should have, and then walked home at 10 o'clock in the cold dark and thought about it honestly. The way you make yourself think about a thing when you've been avoiding it for a while. She was his neighbor. She was kind and competent and funny in a quiet way he'd noticed without registering. She was someone he wanted to see the next day and the day after, and not only because they happened to share a fence line. He stood in his yard in the dark for a while, not doing anything. Then he went inside and did not sleep particularly well, which told him something he hadn't known that morning. The fence between his property and the Cranes ran along the north edge of his pasture. In early October, one of his ewes got through a gap near the old stone post and wandered onto Thomas's land, which meant he had to go over and sort it out and apologize, which he did. Thomas waved off the apology. They talked about the fence. Wesley offered to help repair it that week. Thomas said he'd appreciate that. He came on a Tuesday. Beatrice was outside splitting kindling when he arrived. She looked up and nodded at the fence and said her father had mentioned he was coming. Wesley set to work on the gap. After a few minutes, she finished the kindling and came over to hold the post while he hammered, because it needed 2 people and there were only 2 of them there. They worked for an hour. She didn't talk to fill the silence, which he noticed. When she did talk, it was purposeful, about the fence post depth, about whether they'd need different wire at the far section, about what her father thought of the wheat prices. When he made a dry comment about his least cooperative ewe, she laughed. Not the polite kind, the real kind, surprised out of her. He thought about that laugh for the rest of the day. They started to find reasons to talk at the fence line. It was not calculated. They were both practical people with real work to do, and neither of them would have invented pretexts. But the fence needed more attention that autumn than usual, and the Cranes' north gate had a hinge that needed looking at, and Wesley happened to have the right tools, and one thing and another. 2 people finding the edges of each other's company without quite admitting what they were doing. One afternoon in late October, Thomas Crane said to him, while they were looking at a section of fence together, that Beatrice had been happier lately. He said it simply, looking at the fence, not at Wesley. Wesley didn't say anything. Thomas didn't say anything else. It was a sentence with no follow-up, which made it a great deal louder than it would have been if he'd elaborated. It was a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after that, when Wesley said what he said. He had come over to check the repair they'd done on the far section, which had been worrying him in the wind. Beatrice was hanging laundry in the cold, her breath making small clouds in the morning air, her movements quick and practiced. She didn't see him come around the barn. He stood for a moment. He didn't intend to stand there. There was nothing dramatic about what she was doing. She was hanging shirts in November. But she was doing it with the complete unself-conscious competence she brought to everything, and he was standing there watching her and thinking about what Thomas had said and what the widow Garner had said 2 Sundays ago at church. Wesley Holt. You look at B. Crane like you're trying to memorize her. And before any of that thinking reached a useful conclusion, words came out of him that had been waiting longer than he'd known. You know, Bea, whoever ends up with you is going to be the luckiest man in Harlan County. He meant it as a true thing, said plainly. He expected her to deflect. Instead, she went still, her hands on a shirt, and the color came into her face not dramatically but steadily, like a lamp turned slowly up. She didn't look at him immediately. Then she did, and said what she said. "I've been hoping that man was you." He stood in the cold yard and looked at her, and understood that she had been carrying that for a long time. Not bitterly, not with performance. Just quietly, the way she carried most things, waiting to see if he'd get there on his own. He got there. "Bea," he said. And then, because he was a man who said what he meant when he finally knew what that was, "I meant every word of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know you did," she said. "That's why I answered." She set the shirt back in the basket. "I've thought about you since August at least, probably before." He said he had been thinking about her for longer than that, which was true. He just hadn't known what to call it until recently. "You could have said something," she said. There was no accusation in it, just dry observation, that humor of hers appearing even here. "I'm saying something now," he said. She almost smiled. "You are," she said. Finally, they stood in the cold yard with the laundry half done and the November sky flat and gray above them, and Wesley thought about how peculiar it was that a person could be right next door for 4 years, close enough to borrow tools from, close enough to eat supper with, and how long it could take to actually arrive at what was obvious. He asked her father that evening. He went home, changed his shirt, thought about it for about 20 minutes, and then walked across the field in the November dark and knocked on the Crane door. Thomas answered. He looked at Wesley for a moment with his particular way of seeing things without commenting on them quickly. Then he stepped back and held the door open. They sat in the front room while Adeline found reasons to be elsewhere. Wesley said what he'd come to say directly, without dressing it up. He'd like to come calling on Beatrice with Thomas's blessing, and he wanted to say so plainly instead of letting it drift. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. "Wesley," he said, "we've been watching you figure this out since late summer. My wife had an opinion about when you'd get there. I had a different opinion. Neither of us was right, but I was closer." Wesley said he was sorry it had taken him this long. "Don't apologize," Thomas said. "You're here." He looked at him. "She's not easy to know, my daughter. She doesn't put herself forward. You have to pay attention." He paused. "You've been paying attention." "Yes," Wesley said. He had been. Thomas nodded once, the way that men of his generation nodded when a thing was settled. "Supper's at 6, he said. "You know where we are." Wesley had supper with the Cranes 4 nights that week. He had not done that deliberately. It was just that each time he came it was natural to stay, and Adeline set the table for 4 without making a production of it. And Thomas told stories about the early settlement years that Wesley had not heard. And Beatrice sat across from him and said quiet, exact things that he found himself turning over on the walk home afterward. On the 3rd evening, after Thomas and Adeline had retired, Wesley and Beatrice sat at the table with the lamp burning low, and she told him something she hadn't told many people. She told him what it had been like to come home from Wichita 2 years ago when her mother's hip failed. She said she had not resented it. She wanted to say that clearly because people sometimes assumed she had. She chose it, she said. It was just that choosing it did not make it simple. He listened. He did not rush to say something reassuring, which she noticed and said so. "Most people," she said, start talking before you're finished." "I'm learning," he said. "From you, partly." She looked at him across the table. "You're a quick study," she said, "when you're paying attention." She meant it as a light thing. But there was warmth underneath it, and he felt it, and he thought, "Yes, I am paying attention now, and I should have been sooner, and I am not going to stop." The courtship went at the pace that 2 people running properties in late autumn can manage, which is to say, it happened in the margins of real work. Evenings by the Crane fire, Sunday afternoons walking the fence line or out along the creek road, talking about things small and large, learning each other in the practical, specific way that people do when they are not performing but simply present. He brought her wildflowers from the east pasture. Not bought flowers. just ones he noticed and thought she would find interesting. She pressed them between the pages of her accounting ledger, which he only found out later, and which told him something about the way she received things quietly. She told him once on a long Sunday walk that she had almost not come back from Wichita, that she had nearly stayed. He asked her what had made her choose otherwise, and she thought about it for a long time before she answered. "I think I knew," she said, "that there was something here I hadn't figured out yet." He didn't ask her to say what that thing was. He thought he might know. She taught him to mend the kind of fine stitching that you needed for feed bags when they split at the seam. He was not good at it. She was patient. He got better. She told him she had not expected him to be teachable, and he said he had not expected to want to learn, and they both understood that neither of them was talking only about stitching. One evening in December, something happened that he did not tell her about for a long time. He was walking across the field toward the Crane house for supper, his breath clouding in the cold, and he stopped. Not because anything was wrong, because something was right. He stood in the dark frozen field with the light of the Crane house ahead of him, warm and yellow in the early dark, and he understood with full clarity what he was walking toward. Not supper, not a pleasant evening, but the wanting itself, the real kind, the irreversible kind, the kind that could be taken away. He knew what it cost to lose things he had wanted directly. He had learned that early and well, and he had been protecting himself against it ever since by not wanting directly. He stood in that field for a while, long enough that he got cold. Then he walked forward anyway. Beatrice opened the door before he knocked. She said the biscuits were going to get hard if he didn't come in, and he stepped inside into the warmth and the smell of supper, and he looked at her in the lamplight, and he thought, "This is what I almost talked myself out of." He asked her in January by the stone post where his fence met the Cranes, which was where the U had gotten through in October and started the whole sequence of events which seemed right. The air was cold and clear, and the sky was the pale gray-white of a Kansas winter. Beatrice had a scarf around her neck and was holding a lantern because they'd come out after supper to check on a ewe of his that had been off her feed. The ewe was fine. They stood at the fence in the cold, not hurrying back. He had been thinking about how to say it. He had a ring his mother had left him, a plain gold band with a small garnet, which he'd been carrying in his coat pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the moment to feel right. He had thought about the stone post, then the creek road, then the Crane parlor, where there was firelight. He had finally understood that there was no setting that would make it easier to say what he meant plainly, and so the setting didn't matter, and so this was fine. "Bea," he said. She turned and looked at him. He said it the way she had taught him, without circling it, without softening it into something easier to take back. He said he knew he had been slow. He knew she had seen it before he had, and had waited without making him feel the waiting. He said he was grateful for that, and he was not going to take it lightly. He said he wanted to build something with her. Not just the practical kind of something, though he meant that too, but the kind of something that lasted past seasons, the kind worth making. "I would like you to marry me," he said, "if you'll have me." She looked at him for a moment. The lantern made a small warm circle around them in the January dark. Her eyes were bright. "Wesley Holt," she said, "you could have asked me in September. Is that a yes?" "That's absolutely a yes," she said, and also an observation. He put his mother's ring on her finger there in the cold, and she looked at it once with an expression that was not about the ring at all, and then she looked at him. And the January dark was around them, and the lantern between them and the stone post where everything had started. Thomas Crane, when he heard, shook Wesley's hand with both of his, which he had never done before. Adeline Crane said she had known since the fence repair in October, and that the only thing that had surprised her was the November timeline, which she had expected to be sooner. Wesley said he was sorry to have disappointed her. She said nonsense, she was just glad he'd gotten there. The wedding was on a Saturday in April, when the prairie grass was coming green and the sky was the clear, hard blue of a Kansas spring. Half of Harlan County came. Beatrice wore a dress her mother had made, ivory wool with simple embroidery at the cuffs, and she walked to him with her father on one arm and her face as clear and certain as Wesley had ever seen it, and he thought, I cannot believe I stood in that field in December and almost talked myself out of this. They said their vows in front of the Methodist pastor, who kept it short because he was better at short, and Thomas Crane's voice went tight when he gave his daughter's hand, and several people in the first 3 rows looked elsewhere for a moment. Wesley looked directly at Beatrice when he spoke his vows. They were for her, not the room. She did the same. Then they were married. Old Sander played the fiddle. Everyone ate and danced on the new-cut grass behind the hall until the sun went pink on the horizon. On the walk home, their first walk home as a married couple, down the road between his property and hers, which were now the same property, Beatrice held his arm and said something he would remember for a long time. I wasn't sure, she said, when you stopped at the fence in September. I thought maybe you meant it the way people say kind things they don't intend. And then you went quiet, and I thought, well, either he heard me or he didn't. Either it will become something or it won't, and here we are, she said. Here we are, he agreed. The years that followed were made of ordinary things done honestly. The sheep operation expanded in the 2nd year, enough to bring in one hand to help through lambing season. Beatrice took over the accounts for both the Crane wheat farm and the Holt sheep operation and ran them with a precision that left Wesley genuinely grateful and occasionally humbled. She organized the first lending system for farming tools in the county, not because anyone asked her to, but because she looked at the situation and saw that 3 families couldn't afford equipment they each needed for only 2 weeks of the year. And the obvious solution was there if you cared to arrange it. People talked about it for years afterward. Beatrice did not talk about it. Their first child was born in the spring of the 3rd year, a girl they named Adeline Ruth, who arrived with opinions and a firm grip and made her grandmother cry with a joy that had no performance in it. Their son came 2 years later, Thomas Edwin, who had Wesley's patience and Beatrice's eye for what mattered. On a January afternoon in the 7th year of their marriage, Wesley was out checking the fence by the stone post when he saw Beatrice coming across the field toward him with both children, Adeline running ahead, Thomas toddling behind with the determined, unsteady speed of a 2-year-old who was not going to be left out. She raised a hand when she saw him. He climbed the fence and went to them. They stood in the winter sun, the children finding important business with a stick and a patch of interesting mud, and Beatrice put her shoulder against his and said, I was thinking about that morning. September. What you said. What I said. Whoever ends up with you, she said, is going to be the luckiest man in Harlan County. She paused. You were right, he said. I'm the lucky one, she said. We're both lucky. Practically, the way she said most things. We're both lucky, he agreed. The children had reached an agreement about the stick and were now in negotiation about the mud. The prairie sky was wide and pale above them, the kind of sky that doesn't care about anything you're feeling, but gives you enough room to feel it anyway. Harlan County kept being Harlan County, cold and open and full of people trying to make something out of the land and the seasons and each other. And Wesley Holt stood in his field on a January afternoon and held on to what he had almost lost before he'd understood he had it, and was grateful with the specific gratitude of a man who knows exactly how close he came to missing the whole thing. There is something worth saying about what happened at that fence in September. Because it wasn't Beatrice who was waiting to be found exactly. She wasn't a thing to be discovered. She was a person who had done everything she needed to do, said what she meant when the moment came, and then let it land where it was going to land. And Wesley wasn't the hero of this story for finally seeing her. He was just a man who stopped protecting himself long enough to be honest, which is a small thing and an enormous one. Most of the time, the life you want isn't far away. It's right there across the fence, holding a laundry basket, waiting not for you to be ready, but for you to stop pretending you aren't. The hard part isn't finding it. The hard part is letting yourself have it. Don't wait until January to say the September thing. Thank you for spending this time with us. Wherever you are today, we're glad you were here. Until next time.